Hi guys! So I have recently discovered Colson Whitehead. I was aware of his existence, of course. It would have been hard to be unaware of the Underground Railroad with all the success it's had. It won the Pulitzer Prize, the National Book Award in the US, and the Arthur C. Clarke Award, among others, I think. Um, but I was never tempted to pick it up because it didn't seem to offer anything new to me. But Colson Whitehead has been getting some buzz lately because his new book came out in July. So I decided to give him a go, and I am now working my way backwards through his publication list. You will have heard about the book that came out in July. It is The Nickel Boys. This is a very short novel that is based on a true story, or rather, it is set in and about an institution that did truly exist in Florida between the years 1900 and 2011, namely the corrective facility by the name of the Dozier School for Boys. The Dozier School was a residential reform school where young offenders were put for rehabilitation. Kids that were arrested for non-violent crimes and also orphan street kids, because the idea was that if you put these young offenders into a regular prison, it would only ruin them for life. If we ignore for the moment the implications of what that says about prisons, I guess this was certainly a good idea, but it was also an idea that was doomed from the beginning to turn into a horrific abomination of this idea. Because if you put the average Joe into a position of power over vulnerable people and with next to no accountability, the worst is bound to happen. Namely, psychological and physical abuse of all flavors. Archaeologists of the University of South Florida have been digging up a secret graveyard on the school grounds next to the official one. In the official one, students or inmates were put who had died of natural causes during their stay in the school, but in the secret one, they seem to have dumped the bodies of those who they put to death so violently and brutally that even they wouldn't have been able to get their mortal remains past the officials. And in these cases, if the boys who had died had any family, the family were usually told that their kids had run away and they were never seen again. In this novel, Colson Whitehead tells the exemplary tale of two boys, two original characters of his, who went through the ordeal of being sentenced to several months in this facility. They are both black boys, and this takes place pre-Civil Rights Act, so segregation is still in full swing, and of course the black part of the student body gets it worst. Whitehead changed the name of the school to the Nickel Academy, but that seems to be pretty much the only point in which he diverged from the model that the Dozier School and the testimonies of the survivors that have come forward provided. None of this is a spoiler, by the way. It's all in the prologue, and there is no slow reveal of the horrors in the school. It is not that kind of tale. It is all on the table from the beginning. The story is set at the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement. Elwood Curtis is a black teenager with great hopes and prospects, so to speak. He is a straight-A student, he is about to begin college classes, the first in his family, and he is excited about the civil rights movement and is looking ahead at what he thinks will be a much brighter future for himself and for all African Americans. He is in for a rude awakening, though, when one day he gets arrested and convicted of a crime that he didn't commit and gets put into the Nickel Academy. He keeps hoping, though, that everything will be alright in the end, or that he can make it so by following the rules and by advancing himself in this way. In this way of thinking, he is very much unlike the friend that he makes at Nickel, a boy named Jack Turner, an orphan who has a much more sober and cynical view of the world and of the way the system works and the extent to which he and Elwood have any agency in the system. This dichotomy is a major theme throughout the book, the question of which attitude is more appropriate and more practical in the face of overwhelming adversity and disenfranchisement. On the one hand, Elwood's faith is admirable and endearing, but it also strikes us as naive. Elwood's conviction that everything will be all right in the end and that he will prevail if he only acts right and if he keeps walking with his head held high and with a sense of dignity. This conviction has been proved wrong again and again in history, and in the end, Martin Luther King Jr.'s exhortations to love your enemies rings wrong, or at least impossible, even to Elwood. On the other hand, Turner's cynical stance is also problematic because it prevents him from taking any action in the first place that might just maybe ultimately lead to change and an improvement of his situation. And by giving up before he has even begun, he makes failure a certainty. This is, of course, a huge, hard question with no easy or one-size-fits-all situations kind of answer. In the book, the question both is and isn't resolved in a manner that is, at the same time, simple and ingenious. It was certainly the best thing about the book. On the whole, I am in two minds about whether I think this is a fantastic book or not. On the one hand, it didn't do much for me. When I read about this whole Dozier School business and watched Coles and Whitehead give interviews about it, I felt like a few lines were enough for me to give me a picture of the situation, and I am quite aware of the abuse that has been going on in institutions like this all over the world throughout history, and we've had our own scandal in Europe quite recently with the abuse that has been going on in residential schools run by the Catholic Church and in Catholic churches. On the other hand, I realize that a lot of people are completely in the dark about the issues and the historical facts that the book deals with. The abuse of children and people in institutions like this, and in residential schools and in orphanages, and racial inequality, segregation, that kind of thing. So obviously books like this are sorely needed. And this one in particular also highlights how very little has changed even to this day. So in this regard, this is a very good book, and I would certainly never not recommend it to anybody. And this is a good segue into the Underground Railroad, which I had avoided until recently because from what I'd heard of it, it didn't seem like it had anything to teach me. And I would still say that it didn't exactly blow my mind, but I thought it was a very, very interesting novel in its concept as well as in its execution, and I enjoyed the reading experience a lot. This book is set in the 1850s and is the story of the slave woman Cora, which is at once her very own particular story and also the universal experience of slaves in the Americas. Cora is a third-generation slave. Her grandmother was kidnapped and sold into slavery in Africa, and Cora was born on a cotton plantation in Georgia. In addition to the omnipresent threats of violence, including sexual abuse from her owners, Cora is also an outcast among her own slave community, and that is why, despite the risk, she doesn't hesitate for very long when a fellow slave asks her to run away with her. By way of the Underground Railroad, that network of sympathetic abolitionists and safe houses which helped escort slaves from the southern states to the northern states and to freedom. But in this book, the Underground Railroad is taken in a literal sense to signify a subway train which transports slaves from state to state and ultimately to freedom. This device situates the story from then on very firmly in the realm of the fabulous and the speculative, and it allows the author to describe a fantastical journey after the model of Gulliver's Travels, where he has his heroine Cora witness at each station and in each state different forms of society and different shapes that the relationship between black and white people can take. So we see white supremacy take different shapes in South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Indiana. And in each of these states, Cora has to find her bearings and has to find out on what beliefs the society and people operate, and has to try and survive in it. All of these scenarios are pretty grim, either from the beginning or they reveal themselves to be so eventually. None of them have their exact historical counterpart in American history, but they all reflect societal models or worldviews that have at one time or another, in one place or another, existed or exist even to this day, or have at the very least fed into the enduring inequality that exists to this day. And to draw a parallel to the Nickel Boys, there is no ultimate justice. In this case, of course, the law is firmly and openly against our protagonists anyway. But there is also no divine justice in the form of the author making sure that everybody gets their just desserts. The story is told by an omniscient narrator, which is very much in keeping with the fable-like character of the book, although he does confine himself to specific points of view more and more as the book progresses. He remains a somewhat distant and detached voice throughout the book, though, which serves to highlight the universality of the experience that Cora goes through. And it is also in keeping with how normal and accepted the atrocities that the book describes that were committed against slaves, and how accepted the fact of slavery itself were in those days. And also, I guess, if you were a slave or are a slave, you have to detach yourself from yourself and your situation to a certain degree to maintain any sanity at all, I guess. The prose in this book is accordingly economic. Whitehead doesn't even begin to try to be lyrical, because clearly for him something as inadequate or even inappropriate as lyricism and whimsical turns of phrase won't serve to do the magnitude and the unspeakableness of the subject any justice. Instead, he delivers everything in sparse words and in a very matter-of-fact way. This might sound unappealing, but I think it is the best possible way in which he could have written this book. That said, I know I've seen and heard that Colson Whitehead has quite a way with words when he wants to, so I'm very interested in seeing what he does when he puts more emphasis on interesting and whimsical language. And the next book of his that I'm going to pick up is Zone 1, which is a zombie novel, but apparently one that puts more emphasis on people after the zombie apocalypse, like The Road or the film 28 Days Later, for instance. I think I'm going to start this book tonight, and I hope I'll be back very soon with a review of this one. Until then, have a nice day. Thank you for watching. Bye.